The morning mist hung low over Edinburgh's Trinity district as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his uniform collar for the third time in 10 minutes. His hands trembled slightly, not from the October cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. After 23 years serving in the Royal Protection Unit, he had guarded prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, and members of the royal family through countless events. But today felt different. Today felt final. The radio crackled in his earpiece as he stood outside number 15 Earl Haig Gardens, one of the charming arts and crafts homes that formed the distinctive quadrangle designed nearly a century ago. The Princess Royal was making an unscheduled visit to this quiet residential street, and James had been specifically requested for this assignment. He didn't know why, and protocol dictated he shouldn't ask. Princess Anne's black Range Rover rounded the corner at precisely 9:30, as punctual as always. James had worked with Her Royal Highness on dozens of occasions over the past decade, and her military precision never wavered. She stepped out of the vehicle with characteristic briskness, her navy wool coat perfectly tailored, her silver hair caught back in an elegant chignon. But something in her bearing struck James as different today, softer somehow, more vulnerable than the iron-willed woman he knew. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James said, offering the customary bow of his head. "James," she acknowledged with a slight nod, but her usual crisp tone carried an unexpected warmth. "Walk with me, would you?" This was unusual. Princess Anne rarely requested informal company during official duties, preferring efficiency over conversation. James fell into step beside her as they moved toward the central garden area that the Earl Haig Gardens houses faced. The space was beautifully maintained, with mature trees providing a canopy over well-tended flower beds and a small children's play area where a young mother pushed her toddler on a swing. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. James noticed how Princess Anne's eyes lingered on ordinary details, the way morning light filtered through the autumn leaves, the sound of children's laughter echoing from nearby houses, the elderly man tending to his roses in one of the front gardens. It was as if she was memorizing each moment. "Do you know the history of this place, James?" Princess Anne asked suddenly, pausing near a weathered wooden bench. "Some of it, ma'am. Built in 1921, designed as housing for workers after the First World War. Named after Field Marshal Earl Haig, of course." "Indeed." She sat down on the bench, another unexpected gesture. Protocol suggested they should keep moving, stay alert, maintain their professional distance. Yet something about her manner encouraged James to join her, maintaining a respectful space but close enough to continue their conversation. "My grandfather knew Earl Haig personally," Princess Anne continued, her gaze fixed on the playing children. "They served together, witnessed things no person should have to witness. Haig understood that after such devastation, people needed more than just houses. They needed homes, communities, places where families could heal and grow." James remained quiet, sensing that Princess Anne was sharing something deeply personal. In all his years of service, he had rarely heard her speak so reflectively about family history or personal connections to the places they visited. "I've been thinking a great deal about legacy lately," she said, her voice softer now. "About what we leave behind when we're gone, not the titles or the ceremonies, but the real impact, the lives we touch, the communities we serve, the changes we make possible." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and James caught sight of the residents beginning to gather at their windows and doorsteps. Word had spread quickly through the quiet neighborhood that Princess Anne was visiting, but the crowd remained respectfully distant, understanding somehow that this was a moment requiring discretion. Princess Anne reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored paper with the royal seal visible in the wax.
"And then they ask for considerable trusted documents."
She held it for a long moment, seeming to weigh not just its physical presence but its significance. "James," she said, turning to face him directly. Her eyes, usually sharp and businesslike, held a depth of emotion he had never seen before. "You've served my family with distinction for many years. Your loyalty and discretion have been exemplary. I have something I need to entrust to you, something that must be handled with the utmost care." The formality of her words contrasted sharply with the intimate setting, making James acutely aware that this moment would be etched in his memory forever. He straightened his shoulders, ready to receive whatever responsibility she was about to place upon him. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Whatever you need." Princess Anne stood slowly, the envelope still clutched in her hands. This concerns arrangements that must be made, people who must be notified, and wishes that must be honored, but not yet. When the time comes, and you'll know when that is, this must be delivered to the address written inside. No one else must handle it. No official channels, no secretaries, no intermediaries. Just you. The weight of her words settled over James like a heavy blanket. He understood, without needing explicit confirmation, that Princess Anne was entrusting him with something related to her final wishes, her own preparations for whatever lay ahead. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the October air. "I understand completely, ma'am." She handed him the envelope, and as their hands briefly touched during the transfer, James felt the slight tremor in her fingers. For just a moment the composed royal facade slipped away, and he saw not Princess Anne, but a woman facing her own mortality, with courage and grace. "There's more," she said, her voice steady again. "Walk with me to number 7. They rose from the bench and continued their slow circuit of the garden. Number 7, Earl Haig Gardens, was slightly different from its neighbors. The front garden more elaborate, with climbing roses that had grown wild over the years, creating a charming but overgrown cottage appearance. "Mrs. Margaret Sinclair lives there," Princess Anne explained as they approached. 87 years old, widow of a Royal Navy officer. "She's been writing to me for 15 years about the work her late husband did establishing veterans' housing programs. Beautiful letters, handwritten, full of stories about the men and women who found homes through his efforts." James glanced toward the house and caught sight of a lace curtain twitching in the front window. An elderly face appeared briefly before disappearing again. "She doesn't know I'm coming today, does she?" he asked. "No, this visit isn't on any official schedule. But she deserves to know that her letters mattered, that her husband's work was valued and remembered. Sometimes the most important conversations happen away from the cameras and crowds." As they reached the front gate of number 7, Princess Anne paused again. "James, what I'm about to do may seem irregular, but I need you to witness it. More than that, I need you to remember it. Every word, every detail. There may come a time when the story of this day becomes important in ways we can't yet imagine." The front door opened before they could knock, and Mrs. Sinclair appeared, her eyes wide with shock and wonder. She was smaller than James had expected from glimpsing her in the window, but her posture was straight and dignified. Her gray hair was carefully arranged, and despite the unexpected nature of the visit, she wore a proper day dress with a string of pearls at her throat. "Your Royal Highness," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I cannot believe. How did you?"
Good morning, Mrs. Pally."
"Sinclair," Princess Anne said warmly, stepping forward to take the elderly woman's hands in her own. "I do hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I've been reading your letters for years, and I felt it was high time we met properly." Tears began to flow down Mrs. Sinclair's weathered cheeks as the reality of the moment sank in. "My letters? You actually read them? I never imagined. I just wanted you to know about Harold's work, about how much it meant to the families. Every single one," Princess Anne assured her. "Your husband's dedication to veterans' housing was remarkable, and your letters have kept his memory alive in the most beautiful way." "May we come in for tea? I'd very much like to hear more of his stories." As James watched this interaction unfold, he began to understand that this visit to Earl Haig Gardens was about far more than delivering an envelope or making official appearances. Princess Anne was creating connections, honoring relationships, and ensuring that certain stories would be preserved and remembered. Mrs. Sinclair led them into her sitting room, which was filled with photographs, medals, and mementos of a life well lived. The walls were covered with pictures of her late husband in his naval uniform, family gatherings spanning decades, and formal photographs of various royal events she had apparently attended over the years. As Princess Anne settled into the offered armchair and accepted a cup of tea from the finest china Mrs. Sinclair possessed, James positioned himself near the window where he could maintain visual contact with their security perimeter while still observing the conversation. What he witnessed over the next hour would stay with him for the rest of his life. A masterclass in genuine human connection, from a woman who had spent decades in the public eye, but rarely allowed her private emotions to show. Princess Anne listened with complete attention as Mrs. Serapa Sinclair shared story after story about her husband's work, asking detailed questions and showing genuine interest in even the smallest details. But it was what happened as they prepared to leave that truly revealed the depth of Princess Anne's intentions. As she rose from her chair, she turned to face Mrs. Sinclair with an expression of profound seriousness. "Margaret," she said, using the elderly woman's first name for the first time, "I want you to know that your husband's work and your dedication to preserving his memory represents the very best of what service means. When I'm gone, I hope people will remember that the true measure of a life isn't in the titles held or the ceremonies attended, but in the difference made for ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Sinclair's eyes widened as she began to understand the deeper meaning behind Princess Anne's words. "Your Royal Highness," she whispered, "surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Princess Anne replied gently. "I'm simply saying that when the time comes for any of us to leave this world, what matters is not how we're mourned, but how we're remembered. Your herald understood that. You understand that. And I hope I've learned to understand it, too." James felt his throat tighten as the full weight of the moment settled over him. This wasn't just a social visit, or even an act of kindness toward an elderly veteran's widow. This was Princess Anne's way of expressing her own philosophy about life, death, and the legacy we leave behind. As they prepared to leave Mrs. Sinclair's home, Princess Anne did something that broke every protocol James had ever learned. She embraced the elderly woman, holding her close for several seconds while Mrs. Sinclair sobbed quietly into her shoulder. "Remember our conversation," Princess Anne whispered, loud enough for James to hear. "Remember that someone who mattered cared about Harold's work, and when the time comes, please share that with anyone who asks." Walking back toward their vehicle, James felt as though he had witnessed something sacred, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended rank and protocol. But he also carried a growing sense of unease about Princess Anne's repeated references to "when the time comes," and her obvious preparation for some undefined future event. As they reached the car, Princess Anne paused one final time, looking back at the beautiful quadrangle of Earl Haig Gardens, with its central green space and the children still playing in the distance. "James," she said quietly, "today you've seen something that very few people ever will, a member of the royal family being simply human. I trust that you'll remember this day not for any official report, but for what it truly was, a reminder that we're all mortal, we all matter, and we all have the power to leave the world a little better than we found it." She climbed into the Range Rover, leaving James to process everything he had witnessed and everything he now carried, both the sealed envelope in his pocket and the weight of understanding that Princess Anne was preparing for something that would change everything. 3 weeks later, James Morrison found himself standing in the same position outside Buckingham Palace where he had begun his career over 2 decades ago. The autumn had deepened into early winter, and the London air carried that particular chill that seemed to seep through even the thickest uniform. But the cold he felt today had nothing to do with the weather. The sealed envelope from Earl Haig Gardens remained in his possession, stored in a secure location at his home according to Princess Anne's explicit instructions. He had told no one about it, not his wife Sarah, not his partner Detective Inspector Collins, not even his immediate supervisor. The weight of that secret had begun to affect his sleep, his appetite, and his concentration during routine assignments. What troubled James most was not the envelope itself, but the pattern he had begun to notice in Princess Anne's recent activities. Through the informal network of protection officers who worked different members of the royal family, he had learned that Her Royal Highness had been making similar unscheduled visits across the United Kingdom. Small towns, rural communities, veteran housing projects, children's hospitals, places that held personal significance but generated no media attention. On this particular morning, James had been assigned to Princess Anne's security detail for what was supposed to be a routine visit to the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. As the longest-serving protection officer currently working with the Princess Royal, he had expected nothing more than the usual professional efficiency that characterized her public engagements. Instead, he found himself witnessing another deeply personal encounter that would forever change his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the burden of royal responsibility. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but Princess Anne had arrived 30 minutes early, unusual for someone whose life was governed by precisely timed schedules. She stood in the college's reception area, studying a wall display of photographs showing veterinary students and faculty members spanning several decades.
"James," she said without turning around, "did you know that I've been patron of this college for over 40 years? Yes, ma'am. Since 1982, I believe. 41 years, to be precise.
I've watched generations of young people come through these halls, dedicate their lives to caring for animals, make sacrifices that most people never understand or appreciate." James moved closer, noting the unusual reflective quality in her voice. The reception area was empty except for a security guard who maintained a respectful distance. But James could sense that Princess Anne wanted to share something important. "There's a young woman I've been following, not officially, you understand, but through reports from the college administrators. Her name is Dr. Sarah Chen. She graduated 5 years ago, top of her class, could have taken a position with any prestigious practice in London. Instead, she chose to work in rural Scotland, providing veterinary care to farming communities that couldn't otherwise afford it." Princess Anne moved to a window that looked out onto the college's courtyard, where students were hurrying between classes despite the gray morning drizzle. "She reminds me of myself at that age," she continued. "Determined, idealistic, convinced that individual effort could make a meaningful difference in the world. The difference is that her work will continue long after she's gone, helping animals and supporting rural communities that are the backbone of our country." The comment about continuing long after she's gone sent another chill through James. He was beginning to understand that Princess Anne's recent behavior wasn't random or sentimental. It was systematic, purposeful, and deeply connected to whatever she was preparing for. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, slightly out of breath and clearly nervous about meeting the Princess Royal. She was younger than James had expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and the sort of practical appearance that suggested someone more concerned with getting work done than making impressions. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Chen said, offering a nervous curtsy. "It's such an honor to meet you. I must admit, I was quite surprised when I received the invitation." "The honor is entirely mine, Dr. Seabar. Chen, I've been following your work in the Highlands, and I wanted to thank you personally for your dedication to underserved communities." James watched as Princess Anne guided the conversation with her characteristic skill, putting Dr. Chen at ease while drawing out stories about her experiences providing veterinary care in remote areas. What emerged was a portrait of genuine dedication. Long drives through difficult terrain, emergency calls in the middle of the night, creative solutions to help farmers who struggled to pay for necessary treatments. "The thing is, Your Royal Highness," Chen explained as they toured the college's teaching facilities, "these communities have been there for generations. The farmers, the shepherds, the people who really understand the land and the animals, they're not asking for charity. They just need someone who understands that their way of life matters, that it's worth preserving." "Exactly," Princess Anne replied, stopping beside a display case filled with antique veterinary instruments. "That's what true service means. Not grand gestures or photo opportunities, but showing up consistently for people whose work is essential but often invisible." As they continued their tour, James noticed that Princess Anne was asking very specific questions about Dr. Chen's future plans, her financial situation, and the challenges she faced in maintaining her practice. It wasn't idle curiosity. She was gathering information for some purpose that hadn't yet been revealed. The conversation took on greater significance when they reached the college's memorial wall, where names of graduates who had died in service were engraved in black granite. Princess Anne paused for a long moment, reading the names with obvious emotion. "Chen," she said finally, "what would you say to someone who wanted to establish an endowment to support rural veterinary practices? something that would ensure dedicated professionals like yourself could continue your work without the constant worry about financial sustainability. Dr. Co. West Himson Mercydale Summit. Chen's eyes widened with surprise and hope. That would be transformative, ma'am. There are so many brilliant veterinarians who want to serve rural communities but simply can't afford to do so. An endowment like that could change everything. I thought as much, Princess Anne replied with satisfaction. I'll have my office contact you about the details. But I want you to understand that this won't be a typical royal charity announcement. No ceremonies, no publicity, no media attention. Just practical support for important work that needs to continue regardless of who's available to champion it publicly. Again, the reference to work continuing regardless of who's available struck James as ominous. He was beginning to piece together a pattern that suggested Princess Anne was systematically arranging for various projects and relationships to survive beyond her own involvement. After Dr. Stewart, Chen left, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected offer of support. Princess Anne asked James to walk with her through the college's library, a beautiful wood-paneled room filled with decades of veterinary journals and textbooks. Sit down, James, she said, indicating a pair of leather chairs near a window overlooking the courtyard. We need to talk about something important. James's heart began beating faster as he settled into the chair across from her. The envelope in his inner pocket suddenly felt heavier, as if Princess Anne was about to provide the context that would explain everything. Over the past several weeks, you've witnessed some rather unusual activities for a member of the royal family, she began. Unscheduled visits, personal conversations with strangers, arrangements being made without official oversight. You've been professional enough not to ask questions, but I'm sure you've been wondering what it all means. Yes, ma'am. I have. Princess Anne leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but not unkind. James, I'm going to tell you something that must remain absolutely confidential until the time comes when it no longer needs to be. Can I trust you with that level of discretion? Of course, Your Royal Highness. Always. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. The prognosis is uncertain, the treatments are experimental, and the timeline is unpredictable. What I do know is that I have limited time to arrange for things that matter to me, relationships that I valued, and projects that I want to see continue. The words hit James like a physical blow. Despite all his speculation and growing concern, hearing the truth stated so matter-of-factly was devastating. Princess Anne, who had always seemed invincible, whose energy and dedication had never wavered, was facing her own mortality with the same practical approach she brought to everything else. The envelope I gave you at Earl Haig Gardens contains instructions for after my death, she continued. Not official arrangements, those are all handled through proper channels. Personal wishes. People who should be contacted. Relationships that should be honored. Stories that should be preserved. James struggled to find his voice. Ma'am, surely there are treatments, specialists, options that haven't been explored. Oh, there are, Princess Anne said with a slight smile. I'm not giving up, James. But I'm also not naive about the possibilities. What I'm doing now is ensuring that if the worst happens, certain things won't be lost or forgotten. The work will continue, the relationships will be honored, and the people who matter most will know that they mattered. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the young veterinary students crossing the courtyard below. That's what today was about. Dr. Chan will receive the funding she needs whether I'm here to oversee it or not. Mrs. Sinclair will know that her husband's work was valued. The envelope you carry contains instructions for a dozen similar situations, people and projects that deserve recognition and support. James joined her at the window, trying to process the magnitude of what she was sharing. Why me, ma'am? Why not family members or senior staff or... Because you've seen it all, James. You've protected me through difficult times, witnessed both my strengths and my failures, and you understand the difference between public duty and private obligation. More importantly, you're someone I trust to carry out these wishes exactly as intended, without trying to improve them or make them more official than they should be. The autumn rain had begun falling harder, creating patterns on the window that blurred the view of the courtyard below. James watched the students hurrying between buildings, their lives full of possibility and future plans, while standing beside a woman who was methodically preparing for the end of her own story. "There's something else," Princess Anne said, returning to her chair. "Over the next few months, there will be more visits like the ones we've made, more conversations like today. I need you to remember all of it, not just the official details, but the human moments. The way Mrs. Reese Sinclair cried when she realized her letters had been read, the hope in Dr. Catasini file. Chen's eyes when she understood that her work would be supported. The real impact that genuine care and attention can have on individual lives. Of course, ma'am. I'll remember everything." Good. Because when the time comes, and I hope it won't be soon, but I must be realistic, there may be people who question why certain arrangements were made, why specific individuals were chosen for recognition or support. You'll be able to tell them that these weren't random acts of sentiment, but carefully considered decisions based on years of observation and genuine appreciation for meaningful service. As they prepared to leave the college, Princess Anne paused one final time in the memorial room, looking again at the names of veterinarians who had died while serving others.
"You know, James," she said quietly, "most people think about death in terms of what they'll miss, what they'll leave behind, what won't be completed.
I prefer to think about what will continue, what impact the work will have long after the person is gone. These names on the wall, they represent lives that mattered because they made other lives better." Walking back to their vehicle through the increasingly heavy rain, James felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a mantle. He was no longer just a protection officer doing his job. He had become the keeper of Princess Anne's final wishes, the guardian of relationships and stories that might otherwise be lost. But more than that, he was witnessing a masterclass in how to face mortality with dignity, purpose, and genuine care for others. Princess Anne wasn't retreating from life or wallowing in self-pity. She was using whatever time she had left to strengthen the connections that mattered most and ensure that important work would continue beyond her own ability to champion it. As they drove through London's busy streets, James made a mental note to remember every detail of this conversation, every nuance of expression, every carefully chosen word. He understood now that he wasn't just carrying an envelope. He was carrying the responsibility to preserve and honor a remarkable woman's final acts of service to the people and causes she held most dear. December arrived with unusual warmth for London. As if the weather itself was refusing to acknowledge the approaching end of the year, James Morrison stood in his kitchen at 5 in the morning, nursing his third cup of coffee and staring at the sealed envelope that now lived in his study safe. 6 weeks had passed since Princess Anne's revelation about her diagnosis, and the weight of carrying her secret had begun to reshape every aspect of his daily life. His wife Sarah had noticed the change, of course. 25 years of marriage had made her sensitive to his moods, and the combination of restless sleep, distracted conversations, and unusual solemnity hadn't escaped her attention. But James couldn't explain the source of his anxiety without violating Princess Anne's trust. So he endured Sarah's worried glances and gentle questions about whether he was considering retirement. The irony wasn't lost on him that protecting Princess Anne's privacy about her illness was causing strain in his own marriage. But he understood that some secrets were too important to share, even with the people we love most. His phone buzzed with a text message that made his stomach drop. Special assignment today. Report to Windsor Castle at 080. Bring overnight kit. Duration unknown. C was Chief Inspector Caroline Webb, James's direct supervisor and one of the most experienced Royal Protection officers in the service. An overnight assignment with unknown duration usually meant one of two things, either a major security threat that required extended coverage, or a personal request from a royal family member for extended protection during a difficult period. Given everything James knew about Princess Anne's condition, he suspected it was the latter. The drive to Windsor Castle took him through countryside that showed the first hints of winter dormancy. Trees stood bare against gray skies, and the fields had taken on the muted brown-green color that would persist until spring. As James navigated familiar roads, he found himself wondering how many more times he would make this journey, how many more assignments he would complete before Princess Anne's condition forced her to step back from public duties.
At Windsor, Chief Inspector Webb met him at the security checkpoint with an expression that confirmed his suspicions about the nature of the assignment. "James," she said, dispensing with the usual pleasantries. "Her Royal Highness has requested you specifically for the next 48 hours. She's hosting a private gathering. No media, no official schedule, very limited staff. Your job is standard protection, but I want you to understand that this isn't a typical royal event." "In what way, ma'am?" Webb paused, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say that Princess Anne is using this weekend to have some important conversations with people who matter to her. Your job is to provide security while staying as unobtrusive as possible. Some of these conversations may be quite personal." James nodded, understanding that he was being given permission to witness whatever Princess Anne felt was important enough to justify a weekend at Windsor Castle. As he made his way to the private apartments where he would be stationed, he tried to prepare himself for whatever emotional challenges lay ahead. The first surprise came when he saw the guest list. Instead of the usual collection of dignitaries, charity officials, and aristocratic friends who typically attended royal gatherings, Princess Anne had invited a remarkable cross-section of ordinary people whose lives had intersected with hers over the decades. Sarah Chen was there, having driven down from Scotland the previous evening. Margaret Sinclair from Earl Haig Gardens had been provided with transportation and accommodations. A young man named David Thornton, whom James recognized as a former stable hand from Gatcombe Park, stood nervously in the castle's reception area wearing his best suit. An elderly woman with snow-white hair and a military bearing introduced herself as Colonel Patricia Hayes, recently retired from the Royal Army Veterinary Corps. But perhaps most surprising was the presence of Emma Foster, a woman in her 40s whom James recognized from newspaper photographs as a social worker who had received an honor from Princess Anne several years earlier for her work with troubled youth in Manchester. As the guests gathered in the castle's green drawing room, James positioned himself where he could observe the proceedings while maintaining appropriate professional distance. What he witnessed over the next several hours would stay with him for the rest of his life. Princess Anne had arranged the weekend not as a formal reception, but as a series of intimate conversations with people whose work had impressed and inspired her over the years. She moved from person to person, spending significant time with each guest, asking detailed questions about their current projects and future plans. With Dr. Chen, she discussed not just the rural veterinary endowment that had been established, but broader questions about sustainable rural communities and the role that animal care played in preserving traditional ways of life. Mrs. Sinclair, initially overwhelmed by the grandeur of Windsor Castle, relaxed visibly as Princess Anne guided their conversation back to her late husband's work and the veterans' housing initiatives that still bore his influence. David Thornton, the former stable hand, had apparently started a program teaching horsemanship to disabled children. James watched as Princess Anne listened with genuine fascination to his descriptions of how horses could help children with autism develop confidence and communication skills. Colonel Hayes had spent 30 years developing protocols for animal care in military operations, work that had saved countless lives, both human and animal, during conflicts around the world. Emma Foster had created a residential program that had successfully transitioned hundreds of homeless youth into stable housing and employment, using innovative approaches that other cities were beginning to adopt. What struck James most forcefully was that Princess Anne hadn't invited these people to honor them or to receive thanks for her support of their work. She had invited them to learn from them, to understand the full scope of their impact, and to ensure that their stories would be preserved and remembered. As the afternoon wore on, James began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented. A member of the royal family conducting what could only be described as exit interviews with people whose work she considered essential to the country's well-being. The most emotional moment came during dinner, when Princess Anne asked each guest to talk about their future plans, their hopes for expanding their work, and the challenges they faced in ensuring that their programs would continue beyond their own active involvement. "The question isn't whether our work will matter in 10 or 20 years," Colonel Hayes said thoughtfully. "The question is whether the next generation will understand why it matters and be willing to carry it forward." "Exactly," Princess Anne replied, her voice carrying an intensity that made everyone at the table pay closer attention. "That's what I've been thinking about lately. How to ensure that important work doesn't depend entirely on the people who started it.
Emma Foster leaned forward, clearly sensing something significant in Princess Anne's tone. Are you developing some sort of mentorship program, Your Royal Highness? A way to connect experienced practitioners with younger people who want to make a difference. Princess Anne smiled, but James could see the sadness behind her eyes. Something like that. I've been making arrangements to ensure that work I consider important will have continued support, even when I'm no longer in a position to provide it directly. The table fell quiet as the guests began to understand the subtext of Princess Anne's words. Sinclair was the first to speak, her voice soft but clear. Your Royal Highness, you're not suggesting that you're planning to retire from public duties, are you? Princess Anne's hesitation was barely perceptible, but James caught it. She was walking a careful line between honesty and discretion, wanting to share her appreciation for these people's work without revealing the medical reality that had prompted this gathering. I'm suggesting that all of us, regardless of our age or circumstances, should be thinking about legacy, she said finally, about how to ensure that the work we consider most important will continue and grow even when we're no longer able to champion it personally. Dr. Chen set down her wine glass with a slight tremor in her hand. Ma'am, forgive me if this is presumptuous, but your words tonight sound rather final, as if you're saying goodbye to something. The silence that followed was profound. James could hear the wind outside the castle walls, the distant sound of traffic on the long walk, the ticking of an antique clock somewhere in the castle's depths. Princess Anne looked around the table at these remarkable people she had brought together, her expression a mixture of affection, sadness, and determination. I'm not saying goodbye, she said carefully. I'm saying thank you. Thank you for doing work that matters, for caring about things that are bigger than yourselves, for showing up consistently even when nobody notices or acknowledges your efforts. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. And I'm asking you to remember that your work has been seen, appreciated, and will be supported. If circumstances change for any of us, the impact you've made will continue to ripple outward in ways you may never fully realize. David Thornton, who had been quiet throughout most of the dinner, suddenly spoke up. Your Royal Highness, I don't know much about royal protocol or proper etiquette, but I know when someone is trying to take care of other people. That's what tonight feels like you're trying to take care of all of us, to make sure we're going to be okay. Princess Anne's composure finally cracked slightly, tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at this young man who had somehow cut through all the careful language to identify exactly what she was trying to accomplish. Yes, she said simply. That's exactly what tonight is about. The remainder of the evening took on a different quality as the guests understood that they were participating in something much more significant than a social gathering. Conversations became more personal, more honest, more focused on the deep motivations that drove each person's work. As James helped coordinate the security arrangements for guests who were staying overnight at the castle, he reflected on what he had witnessed. Princess Anne had created a space for authentic human connection, away from the formal constraints of royal protocol, where she could express genuine appreciation for work that aligned with her own values and priorities. But more than that, she had given these people something invaluable. The knowledge that their efforts had been noticed, valued, and would be remembered by someone whose opinion carried real weight. Later that evening, as James completed his final security rounds, he encountered Princess Anne in one of the castle's corridors. Still dressed in the elegant navy dress she had worn to dinner, but looking exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness. Thank you, James, she said quietly, for everything today and for everything over the past few months. I know this hasn't been easy for you. It's been an honor, ma'am, all of it. She nodded, looking out through a window at the lights of Windsor Great Park stretching into the darkness. Tomorrow we'll have a few more conversations, and then this particular chapter will be complete. But I want you to know that what you've witnessed this weekend represents everything I hope to be remembered for. Not the ceremonies or the titles, but the connections with people who are making the world better in practical, measurable ways. As James watched her walk toward her private apartments, he understood that the weekend at Windsor Castle hadn't been about saying goodbye. It had been about creating a foundation of memory and appreciation that would support these remarkable people's work long after Princess Anne was no longer able to champion it personally. The envelope in his study safe suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a responsibility he was honored to carry. The call came at 4:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in February. James Morrison jolted awake to the urgent buzzing of his secure phone, immediately knowing that this was the moment he had been dreading for months. No one contacted Royal Protection officers at that hour with good news. "Morrison here," he answered, his voice rough with sleep and apprehension. "James, it's Chief Inspector Webb. I need you to come in immediately. There's been a development with Her Royal Highness Princess Anne." The careful neutrality in Webb's voice told James everything he needed to know. Princess Anne's condition had taken a turn, and the carefully maintained facade of normal royal duties was about to crumble. He dressed quickly, kissing his still sleeping wife on the forehead, and leaving a note that he would be away for an undetermined period. The envelope was already in his jacket pocket. Over the months since Princess Anne had entrusted it to him, James had developed the habit of carrying it whenever he was on duty, understanding that the moment for its delivery could arrive without warning. At the secure facility where Royal Protection officers received their briefings, James found an atmosphere of controlled crisis. Senior staff members moved with the kind of focused urgency that indicated a major event was unfolding, but the details were being held closely by only the most senior personnel. Chief Inspector Webb met him in a private conference room, her expression grim but professional. "James, I'm going to be direct with you. Princess Anne collapsed yesterday evening at Gatcombe Park. She was rushed to a private hospital in London, and the medical team is not optimistic. The family has been notified, and arrangements are being made for what may come next." James felt the bottom drop out of his stomach, even though he had been preparing for this possibility for months. Hearing that Princess Anne was dying was completely different from knowing that she was ill. "What's my assignment?" he asked, trying to maintain professional composure. "That's what's unusual about this situation. Princess Anne specifically requested that you be assigned to her security detail during whatever time she has left. She's conscious, she's communicating, and she's making some very specific requests about how she wants to spend her final days." Webb paused, studying James with obvious curiosity. "She also mentioned that you would understand why your presence is particularly important at this time. I assume you know what she's referring to?" James nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to the envelope in his pocket. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Good. Because what she's planning is highly irregular, and I need someone I can trust completely to manage the security aspects while respecting her wishes." The drive to the private hospital took James through London's early morning traffic, past landmarks and familiar streets that suddenly seemed to carry more weight and significance. He found himself memorizing details: the way morning light struck the Thames, the determined faces of people beginning their daily commutes, the unchanged rhythm of a city that would continue long after all of them were gone. At the hospital, James was escorted to a private wing where Princess Anne had been provided with a suite that maintained both medical functionality and personal dignity. She was sitting up in bed when he arrived, wearing an elegant dressing gown instead of a hospital gown, her hair perfectly arranged despite everything she had been through. "James," she said with a weak but genuine smile, "thank you for coming so quickly." "Of course, Your Royal Highness. How are you feeling?" "Honestly, like someone who's running out of time and has important work to finish." She gestured for him to take the chair beside her bed. "The doctors tell me I have perhaps a week, possibly 2 if I'm fortunate. I intend to make the most of it." James struggled to reconcile the matter-of-fact tone with the devastating content of her words. Even facing her own death, Princess Anne maintained the practical efficiency that had characterized her entire approach to royal duty. "I've made arrangements to leave the hospital this afternoon," she continued. "I want to spend my remaining time at Gatcombe Park, surrounded by the things and places that have mattered most to me. But before I go, there are several people I need to see, conversations I need to have, and arrangements I need to finalize." She reached for a leather portfolio on the bedside table, moving slowly but with clear purpose. "The envelope I gave you contains instructions for after my death, but there are some things that need to be handled while I'm still able to communicate directly with the people involved." Over the next several hours, James witnessed something extraordinary. Princess Anne conducting a series of deeply personal meetings from her hospital bed, each carefully orchestrated to accomplish specific goals related to her legacy and the people she cared about. The first visitor was Dr. Sarah Chen, who had driven through the night from Scotland after receiving an urgent call. James watched as Princess Anne explained that the rural veterinary endowment would be expanded significantly through her will, but that she wanted Dr. Chen to understand the full scope of what was being planned. The funding will support not just individual practitioners like yourself, but also training programs, equipment grants, and emergency assistance for rural communities facing veterinary crises, Princess Anne explained. But I need you to help establish the criteria for how these funds are distributed. Your judgment about what rural communities actually need is far better than any committee of administrators could provide. Dr. Silva. Chen was openly weeping by the end of their conversation, but she also left with detailed instructions about her role in overseeing one of the most substantial rural veterinary support programs ever established in the United Kingdom. The second meeting was with Emma Foster, the social worker who had attended the weekend at Windsor Castle. Princess Anne had arranged for a significant endowment to support her youth housing program, but she wanted Emma to understand that the funding came with a request for expansion into other cities. Your model works, Princess Anne told her. The statistics prove it. The young people you've helped are thriving, and other communities desperately need similar programs. I'm asking you to spend the next phase of your career helping other cities replicate what you've accomplished in Manchester. Mrs. Margaret Sinclair's visit was the most emotional of the day. The elderly woman from Earl Haig Gardens arrived with a small bouquet of flowers from her garden and a handwritten letter that she had been carrying since their meeting months earlier. Your Royal Highness, she said, her voice trembling with age and emotion, I brought something that Harold wrote before he died. It's about the importance of ensuring that good work continues even when the people who started it are gone. I thought you might find it meaningful. Princess Anne read the letter with obvious emotion, then looked up at Mrs. Sinclair with tears in her eyes. He understood something that it took me far too long to learn, that true legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about ensuring that important work continues. She then explained to Mrs. Sinclair that a memorial fund was being established in Harold's name to support veterans' housing initiatives across the country, and that Mrs. Sinclair's letters documenting his work would become part of the official record of the program's development. But it was the final meeting of the day that affected James most deeply. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the retired Army veterinary officer from the Windsor weekend, arrived with a thick folder of documents and a proposal that she had apparently been developing since their conversation. Your Royal Highness, she said, setting the folder on Princess Anne's bedside table, you asked us that weekend to think about how our work could continue and grow. I've spent the past 2 months developing a comprehensive plan for training the next generation of military veterinarians, not just in technical skills, but in the kind of dedication and innovation that saves lives in impossible circumstances. Princess Anne spent nearly an hour reviewing Colonel Hayes's proposal, asking detailed questions and suggesting modifications. As James watched, he realized that Princess Anne was essentially conducting a final board meeting, ensuring that projects she considered essential would be properly funded and expertly managed after her death. This is exactly the kind of forward thinking that I hoped our conversations would inspire, Princess Anne told Colonel Hayes. Consider your proposal approved, and consider yourself appointed as the program's first director. As the day wore on and the meetings concluded, James found himself profoundly moved by what he had witnessed. Princess Anne wasn't spending her final days receiving visitors and accepting condolences. She was working, planning, and ensuring that her death would result in expanded opportunities for work she considered essential. That evening, as preparations were made for Princess Anne's transfer to Gatcombe Park, she asked James to walk with her through the hospital's private garden, a small but beautifully maintained space that provided a brief respite from the clinical environment. James, she said as they sat on a bench beside a fountain, tomorrow we'll go home, and I'll have a few more days to complete the arrangements I've been making. The envelope you've been carrying will become relevant very soon, but I want you to understand that it's only one part of a much larger plan. She paused, looking at the garden around them. Early spring flowers beginning to emerge despite the February cold. Evidence of life persisting even in difficult conditions. What you've witnessed over the past several months isn't just about preparing for my death. It's about demonstrating that individual lives can have impact far beyond their apparent scope if we're thoughtful about how we invest our time and resources. James struggled to find adequate words to respond to the magnitude of what she was sharing. Ma'am, what you've accomplished in these final months, the people you've connected with, the programs you've established, it's extraordinary. It's necessary, she corrected gently. Every person in a position of influence has the opportunity to use that influence in service of work that matters. Most of us waste that opportunity because we assume we'll always have more time, more chances, more occasions to make a difference. As they prepared to leave the garden and return to the hospital, Princess Anne turned to James with an expression of profound seriousness. Tomorrow, when we arrive at Gatcombe Park, I'll have one final request for you, something that will complete everything we've been working toward. Are you prepared for that responsibility? James met her gaze directly, understanding that she was asking him to commit to something that would probably be the most important task of his career. Yes, ma'am. Whatever you need. Princess Anne smiled with genuine warmth and gratitude. I knew I could count on you, James. I've always known. As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, James felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket and the even greater weight of understanding that the next few days would determine how Princess Anne's remarkable life would be remembered and how her influence would continue to shape the lives of people she would never meet. Gatcombe Park in early March carried the quiet dignity of a place where someone important had chosen to spend their final days. James Morrison stood at the main entrance to the estate, watching as Princess Anne's car approached through the familiar gates for what he knew would be the last time. The afternoon sunlight streamed through bare tree branches, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed almost ceremonial in their beauty. Princess Anne had insisted on minimal medical equipment at Gatcombe, preferring to maintain the character of her beloved home rather than transform it into a clinical environment. A small medical team remained discreetly available, but the house retained the warmth and personality that had made it her sanctuary for decades. Over the next 3 days, James witnessed the most remarkable conclusion to a remarkable life he could have imagined. Princess Anne spent her time exactly as she had lived, with purpose, dignity, and genuine care for the people and causes that mattered to her. She received a carefully selected stream of visitors, each meeting designed to finalize arrangements that would ensure important work continued beyond her death. James watched as she met with trustees of various charities, directors of organizations she had supported, and individuals whose work she had championed over the years. But it was the quieter moments that affected James most deeply. Princess Anne spent hours walking through her gardens, even when movement became difficult, touching the trees she had planted, checking on the horses that had been her lifelong passion, and sitting in favorite spots where she could see across the Gloucestershire countryside that had nurtured her for so many years. On Thursday morning, she asked James to accompany her to her study, a book-lined room that reflected decades of intellectual curiosity and practical engagement with the world. The walls were covered with photographs spanning her entire life. Official royal portraits, informal family pictures, images from her extensive travels, and photographs documenting her involvement with hundreds of charities and organizations. James, she said, settling into the leather chair where she had conducted so much of her private correspondence over the years. It's time for me to give you the final instructions about the envelope you've been carrying. James took the chair across from her desk, the familiar weight of the envelope in his jacket pocket suddenly feeling more significant than ever. Tomorrow evening, after I'm gone, and the doctors assure me it will be soon, you're to wait exactly 24 hours before opening that envelope. The instructions inside will tell you where to go and what to do, but I want you to understand the larger context before you read the specific details. Princess Anne paused, gathering her thoughts with obvious effort. The past few days had taken a visible toll, but her mind remained sharp and her sense of purpose undiminished. What you'll find in that envelope are instructions for delivering personal messages to 12 different people, individuals whose work has impressed me over the years, but who would never expect to hear from me directly. Some are people you've met during our recent visits, others are strangers whose stories have reached me through various channels. She gestured toward a stack of sealed envelopes on her desk, each one addressed in her careful handwriting. Each envelope contains a personal letter explaining how their work has mattered, what impact it has had, and what support they can expect going forward. But more than that, each letter contains a specific request for how they can help ensure that similar work continues and grows. James began to understand the scope of what Princess Anne had been orchestrating. You're creating a network, ma'am. A group of people who will carry forward the work you've been supporting. Exactly. But it's more than just funding or official recognition. These 12 people represent different approaches to service, different ways of making a meaningful difference. By connecting them with each other and with the resources they need, I'm hoping to create something that will outlast any individual person or organization. Princess Anne opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a handwritten document several pages long. This letter is for you, James. It explains not just the practical instructions for delivering the other messages, but the reasoning behind everything we've done together over these past months. She handed him the document, and James could see the effort it had cost her to write it. Her handwriting, usually so precise, showed the effects of medication and fatigue, but every word was carefully chosen and clearly expressed. Don't read it now, she said. Read it tomorrow night, after you've had time to process what's happened, and before you begin the deliveries. It will help you understand why your role in all of this has been so important. That afternoon, Princess Anne asked James to help her arrange one final task, a video message that would be delivered to the trustees of her various charitable commitments. Using a simple camera setup in her garden, she recorded a 20-minute message that James knew would become one of the most important documents of her legacy. In the video, Princess Anne spoke directly to the camera about the importance of maintaining momentum in charitable work, the danger of allowing good programs to fade away due to administrative changes, and her specific hopes for how the organizations she had supported would continue to evolve and grow. But the most powerful part of the message was her conclusion. Service isn't about the person providing it. It's about the impact on the people receiving it. The best tribute anyone could pay to my memory would be to ensure that the work continues, that it improves, and that it reaches people who need it most. As evening approached, James found himself walking through Gatcom's grounds with Princess Anne for what he knew would be the last time. She moved slowly, pausing frequently to rest, but her determination to visit each of her favorite spots remained strong. They stopped at the stable block where her horses whickered softly in recognition. Princess Anne spent several minutes with each animal, stroking their necks and speaking to them in the gentle voice she reserved for creatures she loved. James watched from a respectful distance, understanding that he was witnessing a series of private goodbyes that carried decades of shared history. They'll be well cared for, she said as they walked away from the stables. I've made arrangements for each of them, matched them with people who will appreciate their individual personalities and needs. Their final stop was a small memorial garden that Princess Anne had created years earlier to honor friends and family members who had died before her. She stood for a long time beside a simple bench, reading the names on discreet plaques that marked the plantings dedicated to various loved ones. Soon someone will plant something here for me, she said quietly. I hope whoever chooses the plant will pick something practical, herbs for cooking, or flowers that attract butterflies, or a tree that will provide shade for people who come here to think. As they walked back toward the house, Princess Anne stopped suddenly and turned to face James directly. In the fading light of the March evening, her face showed both the effects of her illness and the strength of character that had sustained her through decades of public service. James, I need you to promise me something. When people ask you about these final months, about the visits we made and the conversations we had, I want you to tell them the truth. That it was about making connections, ensuring continuity, and recognizing people whose work matters. She paused, gathering strength for what she clearly considered her most important final instruction. But I also want you to tell them that it was about joy. Joy in discovering how much good work is being done by people who never seek recognition. Joy in being able to support that work in practical ways. Joy in knowing that individual effort can make a lasting difference. James felt tears gathering in his eyes as he understood that Princess Anne was giving him permission to share the full story of her final months, not just the practical arrangements she had made, but the human connections and genuine happiness she had found in recognizing and supporting other people's service. I promise, ma'am, I'll tell them everything. Princess Anne smiled with obvious relief and satisfaction. Good, because the story of how someone chooses to face death is often the truest expression of how they chose to live. I want people to know that I chose to spend my final months focused on other people's work, other people's dreams, and other people's hopes for the future. That night, James maintained his security position in the house while Princess Anne slept peacefully in her own bedroom, surrounded by family photographs and personal mementos that reflected a life of service and genuine engagement with the world. She died quietly just before dawn on Friday morning, with the March sunlight beginning to stream through her bedroom windows and the sound of horses moving about in the paddocks below. James was informed immediately by the medical team, and he began the carefully orchestrated process of notifying the appropriate officials and family members. But even in the midst of those official responsibilities, James carried the knowledge that his most important task still lay ahead. In 24 hours, he would open Princess Anne's envelope and begin the final phase of her remarkable plan to ensure that meaningful work would continue and grow long after she was gone. As he watched the morning light spread across Gatcombe Park, James understood that he had been privileged to witness something extraordinary, a demonstration of how individual purpose and careful planning could create a legacy that would touch lives for generations to come. The envelope in his pocket no longer felt like a burden. It felt like the continuation of a story that was just beginning.